Good morning, Mrs. Rancourt here. So in this video, I'm going to go through this 2010 FRQ2 prompt that you guys have already read and written as says does because for homework. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to use our command and conquer approach to kind of break down this prompt before I even start reading, because I want to make sure that I know exactly what I'm looking for and what this prompt is asking me to do before I even dive in and start annotating, okay? So thinking back to our command and conquer prompt, I know some of the things it asks me includes who is the speaker, what is the genre of the text, what is some context behind it. I'm also going to look for any other information within that can help me write my first introductory paragraph. And I'm also going to want to know what exactly is my command and how will I conquer that command. So just be patient with me. I'm using an annotation tool for the first time here, and I am not skilled at it. So let's go ahead and read the prompts. As I read, I'm just going to highlight a few things and then go back to them. So, Benjamin Banneker, the son of former slaves, was a farmer, astronomer, mathematician, surveyor, and author. In 1971, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, framer of the Declaration of Independence and Secretary of State to President George Washington. Read the following excerpt from the letter and write an essay that analyzes how Banneker uses rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. So there's a few different things that I've highlighted here that I know I have to include when I'm thinking about how to conquer the text, and that I'm going to include in my main paragraph, or my introductory paragraph. So the first is we know who the writer is, and we're going to pair that with some context information. So we know that the writer is Benjamin Banneker. Even if you don't know who that is in history, they give you enough information here so that you can write about why he's important during this time period. Okay, so Benjamin Banneker, that's our writer. We're going to pair that with the context here. So we know that he is the son of former slaves, so I'm going to make the assumption here that he is of African American descent. He was a farmer, an astronomer, a mathematician, a surveyor, and an author. So he's kind of a jack of all trades here, meaning that he is skilled in many different areas. He's skilled with the land, he's skilled with science and math, he's skilled with English and writing. So he is a jack of all trades. We know the date here for context as well, so it is 1791. We also know who our audience is, so his intended audience here is Thomas Jefferson. I know that because it's telling me that he's writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson. So that is who our audience is going to be for this writer. Even if you can't recall in your historical times at Lato High School who the heck Thomas Jefferson is, look at that, they tell you. So he was one of the framers of the Declaration of Independence and Secretary of State to our first President of the United States, George Washington. So pretty big deal here that he's writing to. So we know the genre of the text is a letter. And then we have our command here. So our command is that we must write an essay that analyzes how our writer uses rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. So we know right here this is going to be his purpose for writing. He is writing an argument against slavery to Thomas Jefferson in 1791. Some of the things I'm thinking about already that I'm going to look for. Number one, when writing a letter to somebody for an intended purpose, there is definitely going to be certain language that you're going to use. For example, A love letter that I'm going to write to my husband is going to have language in it that will look very different than a letter Benjamin Banneker is writing to Thomas Jefferson arguing against slavery. So, because Thomas Jefferson was such a big deal, not only today, but back in 1791, I'm going to look for things like formal diction. I'm going to make the assumption that Benjamin Banneker is going to use logic and he's going to use high formal diction in order to show Thomas Jefferson not only that he is educated on this topic, that he has respect for this man who he's trying to get to help him, I'm assuming, but I'm also going to make the assumption that he's going to use logos since he is arguing against slavery, okay? So remember, we've talked about how logic is going to be the number one tool many people use when creating an argument, and you try to leave emotion out of it. The other thing I might look for is his use of ethos, because he has this background here of not only being the son of a former slaves, but he's risen above that in order to become a farmer, an astronomer, a mathematician, a surveyor, an author. I'm going to assume maybe he's going to use some of that credibility here to sell Thomas Jefferson on this idea that he wants to argue against slavery. So I'm going to assume that you've already read this text. If you haven't, I would pause this now. I am not going to read this whole text to you. What I'm going to do instead is go through and start pulling out some ideas that I might use when writing an essay that analyzes how Banneker uses rhetorical strategies to argue against slavery. So the way I'm chunking this out is I'm looking paragraph by paragraph, which is something you might have done when you created your says, does, because for this text. So I'm going to focus right now on this first paragraph. And after reading this first paragraph, I already noticed something that I think Benjamin Banneker is going to do. So in the beginning of this paragraph, Benjamin Banneker is incorporating some historical context for his reader. So what he's using here is a reference to the American Revolutionary War, which happened in 1775 to 1783. Notice this letter is written in 1791. So many of you from history, your history classes so far, know that the American Revolutionary War was the Americans fighting against the British. So what he's telling Thomas Jefferson here is to recall that time in which we were fighting and trying to protect our land from the British crown. And that we were doing this in order to avoid what the British were trying to accomplish here, which was forcing us into a state of servitude, meaning that they would take over our country and that we would now have to bow down to the British. So he's using this recall here of a historical event that's happened within like the last 20 years for Thomas Jefferson. So I'm thinking, without having read the rest of this, wink, wink, but I'm thinking that he might be using some logic here to help Thomas Jefferson, who is a white man, step into his shoes and see his perspective of what it might feel like or look like or be like when you're trying to fight off another entity who wants to put you into a state of servitude. So he's definitely creating common ground here with his audience. Remember, when we talk about audience, we talk about what are those audience's values, needs, wants? What is their background? So in order to make this man understand where he's coming from, he has to create a common ground with another race, which can be very hard to try to get someone else to understand life through your eyes, okay? So he's starting off with that, with a historical allusion here that Thomas Jefferson is very aware of and knows about. The next thing I notice after we skip all of this very fancy diction that he uses, if you wanted to focus on diction, you could. I'm not going to in my essay because I feel like a lot of other kids are going to do that. He uses words like entreat, exposed, fortitude, providential. I think that he's obviously playing with his author background here. But again, I think a lot of other AP kids are going to talk about how fancy pants he is. So I'm not going to use it in my essay because I want to be different. The last thing I'm going to kind of draw your attention to is at the end here, he says that it is miraculous how we've overcome this, and that you cannot but acknowledge that the present freedom and tranquility in which you enjoy have mercifully received, and that you have mercifully received, is a peculiar blessing of heaven. So during this time, a lot of people were Christian, and our country was built upon those ideals. A lot of the men that helped frame the Declaration of Independence, that our forefathers who helped founded this country, were practicing Christians. So something I think he might also incorporate here is this use of the belief of a God. Again, that is an audience's belief, okay? So when he's connecting to this audience, he knows exactly what's going to get Thomas Jefferson to listen to him. And one of those things might be his belief in God, or his belief in a miraculous gift from heaven above. Paragraph 2 might be one of my favorite paragraphs of this text, because I love in an argument when a writer uses the audience's words against them, or to help convince them that of their argument. So in this case, something that Benjamin Banneker is doing is he's using a quote from the Declaration of Independence to help create this argument about how slavery is a terrible, terrible thing. So in the beginning, he says to his audience, Thomas Jefferson, that during this war, during this time when the British Crown was trying to reduce you to a state of servitude, you clearly saw this injustice of a state of slavery, and you had apprehensions of the horrors of its conditions. Even if you don't know what some of those words mean, horrors of its condition, I think you can come up with. And he's explaining there that Thomas Jefferson understands how absolutely terrible this is, and because of that, he created a valuable doctrine. So that is that text, the Declaration of Independence, which came after this American Revolutionary War. So inside of that doctrine, inside of that declaration that he created to protect his freedom, he includes this quote: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So within the text that this man helps create, they write that all men are created equal. We know that that is not true during this time period if you were black or if you were white. All white men were created equal, but at the time they were forcing African Americans into slavery here. So he is using Thomas Jefferson's argument against him, which I think is so clever to do in an argument. Notice also that he's not doing it in a way that would be offensive. So when you are creating an argument for an audience, you never want to offend your audience, because if you upset your audience or you offend their belief system, their background, their values, they won't listen to what you have to say. So in this case, I want you to think about, in this paragraph, how do you know that that Benjamin Banneker is not trying to offend Thomas Jefferson? I want you to think about what words he's using. For example, his repetition of the word sir, to show a sign of respect for this man. He continues to do that throughout each paragraph, throughout the piece, repeatedly calling Thomas Jefferson sir. I want you to think about the language he's using, the words he's using to speak to this man. So the tool that I'm using to record this video right now cuts me off at 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pause this video, and then the rest of this document will have to be watched in a part 2.